They say the Wild West was a place of constant danger of saloon brawls, dusty duels, and lawmen who shot first and asked questions never. Hollywood has painted sheriffs as fearless gunslingers, walking down Main Street with revolvers at their hips and justice in their eyes. But what if I told you that reality was a lot quieter and a whole lot messier? Tonight, we are stepping back into the 1880s, not the version you have seen in movies, but the real American frontier, where sheriffs did not draw their guns every day. In fact, most never fired them at all. Instead, they carried ledgers instead of rifles, negotiated disputes instead of shootouts, and spent more time chasing down unpaid taxes than outlaws. Welcome to a different kind of Wild West. One where the biggest threat was not always a bandit, but a town council member with too much power. One where the law was built on compromise, paperwork, and a deep, exhausting sense of responsibility. Before we saddle up and ride into this story, take a moment to settle in. Adjust your pillows, dim the lights, and let your imagination do the traveling. If you enjoy these immersive journeys into the past where history meets storytelling, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. It helps us reach more curious minds like yours and keeps these stories coming every week. Now, picture this. It is early morning in a cattle town in Kansas. The year is 1883. The wooden floor beneath your bed creaks as you stir. No smartphones, no central heating, just the smell of wood smoke lingering in the air and the faint sound of wagon wheels on dirt roads. You are not just waking up in this town, you are waking up as a man with a mission. Today is election day, and you are running to become county sheriff. It is not about being the fastest draw or the toughest brawler. You have spent the past month shaking hands with ranchers, assuring the church ladies you will keep order on Sundays, and promising shopkeepers you will keep drunks from smashing their windows. The job is not glamorous, but it matters. Especially out here, where civilization is still finding its footing and law is more suggestion than certainty. And if no, when you win, a whole new world will open up. One full of power, yes, but also problems. One where your badge might protect you, or paint a target on your back. This is not the Wild West you have heard about. It is the one history forgot. Let us ride. The morning sun spills over the rooftops of a quiet frontier town, casting long shadows across wooden porches and dust-covered streets. A rooster crows in the distance, and somewhere a blacksmith's hammer strikes iron with rhythmic certainty. As your eyes blink open, the creak of the bed beneath you reminds you this is not just any morning, it is Election Day. And you are running to become the next county sheriff. You sit up slowly, rubbing sleep from your eyes as you listen to the waking world around you. The smell of bacon frying a few doors down drifts through the window. Outside, a horse snorts near the hitching post, and a wagon rattles over uneven boards. The town is small, maybe no more than a few hundred souls, but every one of them will be watching today. Some with hope, others with suspicion. They know you. They've seen you at the church bake sales, heard you speak at town meetings, watched you help old Mr. Keaton when his barn caught fire last summer. You are not a stranger here. But becoming sheriff, that is something else entirely. Your boots thud against the wooden floor as you stand, stretching muscles sore from yesterday's door-to-door visits. Campaigning in a place like this does not involve posters or debates. It is about looking a man in the eye, listening to his troubles, and promising without fanfare that you will do right by him. It is about making the school teacher feel safe walking home after dark, and convincing the saloon owner that keeping the peace does not mean shutting down his business. It is a delicate balance between order and freedom, and no amount of charm will save you if you do not deliver. Downstairs, the aroma of strong coffee meets you like an old friend. You pour a cup and step outside, nodding to old Annie across the street as she sweeps dust off her porch. She pauses to give you a firm smile. "Big day, Sheriff," she calls out. already speaking as if it is decided. You tip your hat with a chuckle, not denying it, not accepting it, just letting it sit in the air. As you walk toward the center of town, the full weight of the day begins to settle on your shoulders. You have read the wanted posters tacked outside the telegraph office, but you know that being sheriff is not about chasing fugitives with a pistol drawn. It is about resolving land disputes before they turn into blood feuds. It is about keeping the peace when tempers flare over cattle fences or unpaid debts. It is about reminding the banker to extend grace to a struggling farmer, or standing between two neighbors when old grievances threaten to ignite. Yes, you have carried a gun, but you have carried a ledger far more often. And if elected, you will spend more time filing paperwork, serving writs, collecting taxes, and mediating between stubborn men than you will galloping after outlaws. That does not make the job less noble. It makes it harder. It demands patience over violence, tact over intimidation, and a steady presence in a world where everything else shifts with the wind. As the town gathers near the schoolhouse, makeshift booths are set up, and ballots begin to be cast. Children weave between adults, laughing as they chase one another, unaware of the quiet tension in the air. Your opponent, a grizzled ex-soldier named Doyle, stands near the general store, arms folded, eyes following you. He is a man respected for his strength, feared for his temper. He believes in swift justice, sometimes too swift. Many remember the time he nearly shot a drunkard for knocking over a barrel of pickles. They remember, too, that he once dragged a man through the streets for cheating at poker. He says that is law. You say law starts before the brawl, not after. The townsfolk vote. One by one, their names are marked and their voices counted. And as the sun arcs overhead, a hush falls over the crowd. The mayor, a stern but fair woman named Abigail Turner, reads the results aloud from a slip of paper, her voice clear and unshaking. You have won. The applause is not thunderous, but it is heartfelt. Hands clasp your shoulder. Annie hands you a fresh-baked biscuit. A rancher with tears in his eyes thanks you for giving his boys a future to believe in. But even as the crowd begins to disperse, you feel something shift inside you. This is not a celebration. It is a beginning. Later that evening, as the stars emerge over the prairie sky, you sit alone on the steps of the sheriff's office, newly yours. The badge rests heavy in your palm, not because of its weight, but because of what it stands for. Responsibility, restraint, resolve. This is not about being a hero in a dime novel. This is about being a rock in the middle of a restless river. You hear footsteps approach Mrs. Duncan from the boarding house, her face lined with worry. There has been a quarrel between two young ranch hands over a stolen horse. She is afraid it might turn violent. You rise without hesitation, pocketing the badge, adjusting your hat, and walking into the night, not with a gun drawn, but with your voice ready, your presence steady, and your mind sharp. Because in the real Wild West, justice was not about the fastest draw. It was about the calmest hand. And now, that hand, hey, is yours. The morning sun crept through the dust-covered windows of the town hall, casting a warm glow on the faded wooden floors. Outside, the town of Dry Creek had barely begun to stir, just the distant sound of a blacksmith hammering and the creak of wagon wheels on dry dirt. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. The election results were in. After a tense week of handshakes, firm promises, and more than a few skeptical glances from townsfolk, the verdict had arrived. Standing at the front of the hall, Judge Rawlins cleared his throat. He was a man of few words and even fewer expressions, but as he looked down at the slip of paper in his hands, there was the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, by a count of 83 to 77. He announced, voice echoing across the sparse room, "The people of Dry Creek have elected their new county sheriff, Mr. James Alden." There was a long moment of silence, followed by polite applause. Some clapped with cautious approval, others out of sheer obligation. Hank Miller, the long-serving deputy, and the other candidate gave a tight-lipped nod before quietly stepping back into the crowd. James felt his heart thudding in his chest, not with triumph, but with the weight of what came next. He walked to the front, boots clicking softly on the worn floorboards. Judge Rawlins reached into a small wooden box and withdrew a six-pointed brass badge, dull with age but still catching the light, just enough to remind everyone what it symbolized. It was not polished or fancy, not like in the dime novels, but it was real. Heavy, too, when Rawlins pressed it into James's hand. "This ain't a reward," the judge muttered under his breath. "It is a responsibility." James nodded, staring at the badge for a moment before pinning it to his vest. The applause faded. Outside, life went on. Traders argued over prices, children chased stray chickens, and a tumbleweed rolled past the dusty main street, like nothing had changed at all. But for James Alden, everything had changed. The badge marked not just a new chapter, but a new burden. Being sheriff was not about glory. It was about being the first to rise when trouble stirred, and the last to sleep when others rested, safely behind their doors. It meant attending to more than just gunslingers and outlaws. In fact, as James would soon discover, violence was the rare exception, not the rule. His first task, escorting old Mr. Elkins to the general store to mediate a dispute over a shipment of spoiled flour. The second, filing a missing mule report and helping a rancher track it down before nightfall. By dusk, he was scrubbing soot from the steps of the jailhouse and reviewing overdue property tax ledgers from the county office. As twilight fell over the planes and lanterns flickered to life one by one along Main Street, James stood alone outside his office, watching the world settle into its quiet rhythms. He could already feel the strain between what people expected and what the job actually required. There were no showdowns at high noon, no dramatic duels in the street. There was only paperwork, complaints, compromises, and the slow grind of justice in a town that barely believed in it. Still, he did not regret it. He remembered his father's words before he left their homestead. "Real justice ain't loud, son. It is steady. It shows up every day and does what needs doing, even when no one says thank you." That sentiment now lived under his skin. That night, seated alone in the small, dimly lit sheriff's office, James opened the town ledger. A dusty record of births, deaths, marriages, fines, and petty crimes stretched before him. The town's heartbeat in ink and parchment. There were no grand plans or heroic missions, just the daily evidence of life and the fragile line between order and chaos. He knew Hank Miller had not been happy about the loss, but the man had still nodded to him that morning. There was something in that gesture, something unspoken but important. Respect, maybe. Or resignation. Either way, it told James he would need to tread carefully, especially with those who had worn the badge longer than he had. Outside, an owl hooted in the distance, and the wind whispered through the dry eaves of the jailhouse. James reached for the lantern, trimmed the wick, and leaned back in his chair. The badge on his chest caught the light for just a moment, reminding him again that it was more than a symbol. It was a promise. To serve, to mediate, to hold a fragile peace in a land still deciding what peace meant. Tomorrow would bring more disputes, maybe a runaway horse, maybe a traveling salesman stirring trouble, or maybe just someone needing help patching a broken fence. There might be moments of danger, yes, but there would be far more hours of quiet service, invisible but essential, and that, he now realized, was the real story of a Wild West sheriff. Barely a week had passed since the town had placed a simple six-pointed badge on your chest. The brass still glinted fresh in the morning sun, a symbol of duty, though not yet respect. You were still learning the rhythm of life. As the new sheriff, signing off property claims, settling landline feuds between neighbors, helping the schoolteacher fix her broken doorframe, even chasing a loose mule through the muddy main road. It was not glamorous, but it mattered. Every kind word from a townsperson, every nod of quiet gratitude, reminded you why you had taken the job. You were here to keep the peace, to stand between the town and the chaos that threatened to crawl in from the edges of the frontier. Then came the cowboys. They rode in just after sundown, 6 of them, all caked in dust and smelling of whiskey and sweat. Their horses pawed impatiently at the earth outside the saloon as they dismounted with the exaggerated swagger of men who had never heard the word no and did not intend to start listening now. They were not outlaws, at least not officially, but everyone in town knew trouble followed them, like flies. The ringleader, a tall man with sun-leathered skin and a scar above one eye, walked straight up to your office door and spat tobacco on the step before knocking. "Sheriff," he said, without waiting for an invitation. "Heard there is a new badge in town." You stood up slowly from your desk, trying not to betray even a flicker of uncertainty. You had seen this kind before in your father's stories, men who lived by their own code, who did not believe in courts or laws or consequences. Still, you opened the door and stepped outside, nodding politely. "Afternoon," you said, voice calm but firm. "Name's Cole. Sheriff Cole." The man laughed. "Name's Jed Barker. We pass through here every spring. Usually do not got much need to talk to lawmen, but folks say you are new, so I figured I would offer a friendly welcome." The tone did not match the words. It was oily, heavy, with unspoken threat. You nodded again, watching as the other cowboys leaned on railings and eyed the townsfolk like wolves studying a herd. "I appreciate the gesture," you said carefully, "but let us keep things quiet this time. No brawls in the saloon, no horses on the boardwalk, no threats, spoken or implied." Jed's grin faded. "See, that is what I wanted to clear up, Sheriff. We are not the kind of men who like being told what to do, especially not by someone fresh out of the voting box." You felt the eyes on you, the shopkeeper peeking through curtains, the banker's son frozen by the well, the widow across the street clutching her baby a little tighter. This was not just about you. It was about what the badge meant and whether it had teeth. "I am not asking," you said. "This is a peaceful town. I intend to keep it that way." There was a long silence, the kind of silence that could go either way toward laughter or blood. Jed held your stare for a few seconds longer than comfort allowed. Then, with a snort, he stepped back and tipped his hat mockingly. "Well," he said, "we will see how long that lasts." They swaggered off toward the saloon, boots thudding like war drums. You did not follow. Not yet. You stood there a moment, heart steady but wary, the cool wind brushing past, as if trying to push you into action. Inside the saloon, piano keys rang out again, but now with a different rhythm, faster, sharper, like even the music knew the stakes had changed. A glass shattered. Laughter followed. Too loud, too forced. The bartender locked eyes with you through the window, his jaw clenched. You took a breath and stepped back into your office, closing the door behind you. There was no arrest to make yet. No crime had been committed. Just a warning, thinly veiled in casual threats, aimed not just at you, but at the entire notion of law and order. That was the real test. Whether your authority would mean anything, when men like Jed Barker chose to test its limits. As you sat down again at your desk, you felt the weight of the badge settle a little heavier on your chest. This was not going to be a job of signing papers and fixing fences. The town had seen that already, and soon you would have to show them what kind of sheriff you were prepared to become. Not with your gun, but with your resolve. Because in a land where chaos rode on horseback, law had to ride taller. While the sheriff's badge might gleam in the morning sun, the reality of wearing it sinks in quickly. Gone is the brief thrill of winning the election against Deputy Hank Miller, whose stiff nod during the ceremony barely masked years of pent-up rivalry. In its place now is a steady rhythm of tasks few dreamt of when imagining frontier justice. No one writes songs about sorting cattle disputes or debating with the town clerk over property lines, yet these were the fires that truly kept the town from burning. On the second week in office, the new sheriff wakes before dawn, long before the saloons stir and the dust settles from the previous night's stomping boots. There is no gunfight waiting outside, only a mountain of civil requests. A woman named Mrs. Cullen insists her neighbor's pigs have crossed into her vegetable patch, uprooting precious squash and corn. She brings a piece of a chewed-up leaf as evidence, demanding a citation be issued and reparations paid. The sheriff, pen in hand, listens with the same gravity he would later give to a heated saloon brawl, because this, too, is law and order. Tax records arrive from the county seat, printed on fragile, weathered paper. They need to be sorted, signatures collected, amounts calculated. Some residents can't pay, some refuse to. The sheriff must walk the line between fairness and firmness. More than once, the job demands stepping inside someone's home, not with a revolver, but with receipts, and a reminder that the town can't survive without its citizens pulling together. The mayor, a rotund man with a tendency to sweat through his vest, visits almost daily. He rarely brings good news. There are arguments at the general store over pricing. The schoolhouse is short on firewood. The jail's roof leaks. Every complaint is pushed across the desk of the sheriff, whose role, it turns out, is as much janitor of the town's problems as its defender. Paperwork stacks up fast. There are permits to process, court dates to coordinate, and affidavits to stamp. The sheriff's desk, an old oak slab with a bullet hole from some long-forgotten scuffle, is more often covered in ink than blood. The pistol at the hip remains untouched most days, its weight symbolic, not practical. It is there because it has to be, not because it is needed. Sometimes the sheriff walks the perimeter of the town just to get some air. During one of these walks, a teenage boy named Eli runs up in a panic. He is lost. 2 cows. The sheriff follows him down a winding trail, finds the animals stuck near a river bend, and helps herd them back. No crowd watches, no newspaper prints the story. But to Eli and his family, it is the most important thing that happened all week. Evenings are no less busy. The sheriff attends town meetings where voices rise and tempers flare, not over crime, but over fence lines and water rights. Behind closed doors, local politicians push personal agendas. They ask for favors, hint at alliances. The sheriff must navigate this delicate dance without slipping, careful not to owe the wrong man too much, careful not to lose the people's trust. All the while, the cowboys who once issued thinly veiled threats still linger at the saloons, drinking and muttering. They test boundaries with sideways glances and rough language, but they have yet to cross the line into outright defiance. Maybe they are waiting. Maybe they are watching to see if the sheriff is just another nameplate on the door, or someone who will hold firm when it counts. The work is relentless, the respect slow to come. Children point when the sheriff walks past, some in awe, others just curious. Merchants nod politely, farmers wave from their wagons, and the town slowly begins to adjust. It is not glory they see, but dependability. They notice that streets are swept more often now. Disputes are settled before they explode. There is a sense that someone is watching, not to punish, but to protect. One night, as the sheriff finally locks the office door and heads toward the small home provided by the county, he passes a window lit from inside. A family is seated at a table, hands clasped in grace before supper. Through the glass, the sheriff sees peace, not the kind born from heroics, but the quieter kind that grows when people believe their town is in good hands. That is when it becomes clear. The true weight of the badge is not in its shine or the title it grants, but in the daily decisions that shape the lives around it. It is in choosing to treat every squabble with dignity, every complaint with care. The badge does not demand fear, it asks for responsibility, and with each passing day, the sheriff wears it not to be seen but to serve. It was a little after dawn when the knock came on the sheriff's office door. The sound echoed in the quiet of the waking town, sharp and purposeful. Standing on the threshold was Mary Thompson, the postmaster's wife, her face pale and her hands trembling beneath a wool shawl. "Samuel Johnson," she said, barely above a whisper. "He has been found." out on the edge of his pasture. "Dury dead." The words hung heavy in the air. Samuel Johnson was not just any settler. He was known for his quiet wisdom, his fair cattle trades, and for being the kind of man who never sought trouble. And now, the very first murder in the new sheriff's watch had struck someone the entire town considered decent and kind. The sheriff saddled up in silence. No posse, no loud dramatics. Just a rifle, a worn notebook, and a heart weighed down by the knowledge that justice was not always as clean or swift as a gunshot. The ride out to the Johnson place was long, the plains stretching far in every direction, heat rising in gentle waves as the sun cleared the horizon. Wind moved through the sagebrush like whispers, as if the land itself sensed what had happened. He found Samuel's body lying awkwardly near the fence line, face turned toward the sky, hat discarded a few feet away. There was no mistaking. The fatal wound, a clean shot to the chest, but no weapon nearby. His horse, tethered to a fence post, was calm but alert. Nothing had been stolen. No footprints beyond Samuel's and the horse's. Not even signs of a struggle. The sheriff knelt quietly, not touching the body, just observing. This was no random killing. It was too deliberate, too silent. And it did not take long for the weight of his role to bear down on him in a way that no town meeting or ordinance paperwork ever could. This was not tax collection or cattle permit disputes. This was death. And the town would expect answers soon. By noon, word had reached every saloon, feed store, and kitchen in town. Gossip traveled faster than any telegram. Some whispered about rustlers, others about old debts, and a few pointed toward newcomers who had not yet earned the town's trust. But the sheriff, methodical and quiet, kept his thoughts to himself. He spent the afternoon speaking with Samuel's widow, who was numb with grief, but clear enough to recount that her husband had no known enemies, though he had argued last week with Deputy Hank. "Miller, nothing serious," she said, "just a disagreement over land boundaries." Hank had denied it outright when questioned. But there was something in his eyes that made the sheriff file the detail away. As evening fell, the sheriff returned to his desk and began sorting through what little evidence there was. The clean shot, the lack of robbery, the silence. It was not enough. Not for an arrest. Not yet. And here was the cruel irony of justice in the frontier. When the dust settled, often it was not heroism or gunplay that brought resolution, but patience. Persistence. He wrote notes by lantern light, cataloging timelines, names, questions. Outside, laughter drifted from the saloon. Life continued. It always did. But inside, the burden pressed heavier than ever. This was not the kind of thing he read about in dime novels. There was no dramatic standoff at high noon. Just sorrow, silence, and the growing realization that being a sheriff meant shouldering the pain of others without letting it break you. That night, alone in his small quarters behind the office, the sheriff took off the six-pointed badge and stared at it for a long time. It gleamed dully in the lamplight. Still new, still unfamiliar. But its weight was becoming all too real. This was not the job most imagined when they cast their votes. And it certainly was not the job he would dreamed of as a boy, watching marshals ride into town. It was something harder, quieter, more human. He set the badge gently on the desk and picked up Samuel's hat, which he had carried back from the scene. Turning it in his hands, he made a silent promise not just to fine whoever was responsible, but to remain steady in the face of everything this land could throw at a man. For in the Wild West, justice was not just about outlaws and shootouts. Sometimes it was about listening more than speaking, watching more than acting, and carrying truths too heavy for others to bear. And as the wind howled softly outside, the sheriff prepared for the long days ahead, knowing full well that this murder was only the beginning. The summer heat hung low over the prairie as the sheriff tightened his saddle straps, the worn leather creaking under the strain. Word had come from the next county over Pete Rollins. The man suspected in the killing of Samuel Johnson had been located, But something about the message did not sit right. It was not the relief of a job done. It was too sudden, too quiet. There had been no pursuit, no manhunt, just a telegram. Rollins in custody. Come collect him. And beneath the neatly typed words, a hastily scribbled line in pencil. He is in rough shape. Riding eastward, the sheriff passed fields of brittle corn and wilting sunflowers. The landscape seemed tired, mirroring the thoughts circling in his head. Pete Rollins was not just another name in a report. He was known to many in town, not well liked, but known. A man with debts, a quick temper, and a knack for vanishing when things went south, but also a man who, despite all that, had never been known for outright violence. The murder of Johnson had come as a shock, and now this sudden apprehension carried a foul taste like bread gone moldy too soon. When he arrived at the county jail, the deputy on duty avoided his eyes. Rollins was being kept in a back cell, bandaged hastily, and lying half-conscious on a cot. His face was a ruin of bruises, one eye swollen shut, his jaw possibly broken. His wrists bore fresh rope burns, suggesting he had not gone quietly. But it was not the resistance that disturbed the sheriff. It was the silence. No official report had been filed, no mention of where Rollins had been found, or who had brought him in. "What happened to him?" the sheriff asked, voice low. The deputy shrugged. Resisted arrest. Sheriff Bauer said he had to be handled rough. Caused trouble at a saloon out near Dunn's Crossing. But something in the man's posture told a different story. The sheriff did not press the issue yet. He asked for the paperwork. It was not ready, hadn't even been started. The arrest, it seemed, had skipped procedure. The ride back was quiet. Rollins groaned now and then, but mostly drifted in and out of consciousness. By the time they arrived at the town jail, dusk had begun to paint the streets in rust and gold. News spread fast. Folks gathered on porches and along fences to catch a glimpse of the man they believed had killed Samuel Johnson. Whispers floated on the air. Some spoke of justice, others of revenge. The sheriff did not like the tone. Inside the jail, he locked Rollins in the farthest cell and sat down at his desk. He poured himself a glass of water, the cup trembling slightly in his hand. Something was off. He thought back to the crime scene. Johnson had not died in a fight. He had been shot from behind, execution style, while tending to his chickens. No sign of robbery, no motive anyone could point to, except a long-standing boundary dispute over a patch of creekside land that Rollins had once claimed was his. But would that truly drive a man to murder? Later that night, as the sheriff sat reviewing notes under the dim glow of a lantern, there was a knock at the door. It was Clara, Samuel Johnson's widow. Her eyes were red, rimmed, but steady. She was not there to weep or accuse. She had something to say. "Pete did not do it," she said simply. The sheriff blinked. "Madam, Samuel had enemies. Not the kind who'd shout about it, but the kind who'd smile at you in church while plotting to take everything you owned. You know the type. Pete argued with Sam. Sure, but he never hated him. Others did. Men with more to gain." He invited her to sit. They spoke for nearly an hour. Clara named 2 other men, local ranchers, who had tried to buy Samuel's land multiple times. When rebuffed, they had grown sour. One, in particular, had been spotted riding near the Johnson place 2 days before the killing. The same man had donated generously to the sheriff's campaign. That small, seemingly unrelated detail now weighed heavily on his mind. Over the next few days, the sheriff began to dig deeper. He spoke with barkeeps, field hands, a mail carrier who recalled seeing a black-coated figure near Johnson's property around the time of the murder. He re-interviewed townsfolk and reviewed property records, finding documents that hinted at a quiet but aggressive push to acquire land along the waterline, a plan that Johnson had refused to support. Meanwhile, Rollins, slowly healing in his cell, remained mostly silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse but clear. He swore he had not killed Johnson. He had been laying low in a line shack on the border, hiding from debt collectors. He admitted he would run because he was afraid of being blamed, but he had not raised a hand to the old man. The sheriff believed him. Not fully, he could not. Not yet, but enough to hold back the pitchforks. He knew now that this badge he wore was not just for show. Justice was not about catching the first man that looked guilty. It was about standing firm when the truth threatened to crumble under pressure. And as pressure mounted from townsfolk demanding a trial and others whispering that he would gone soft, the sheriff knew he was closing in on something much bigger, not just a killer, but a conspiracy. And this time, the fight would not be with bandits on horseback or drunk cowboys in the saloon. It would be waged behind smiles, under handshakes, and through ink spilled on paper contracts. The kind of fight a lawman does not win with bullets, but with courage. And he was just getting started. By the third month in office, the badge no longer felt foreign pinned to his chest. The sheriff had learned the rhythms of the town, its habits, its grudges, its silences. But law-keeping in Dry Creek was far from the shootouts told in pulp stories. Much of it was slow, tangled in ego and memory, and no part more trying than the nightly dramas that unfolded behind the swinging doors of the Lone Lantern Saloon. It often began with voices too loud, laughter laced with something bitter. Whiskey had a way of coaxing out old wounds, and in Dry Creek nearly everyone nursed one. A veteran missing 2 fingers from Antietam got called a coward by a ranch hand who never left the county. A man with a bruised pride accused another of cheating over a hand of poker, not for the first time. Sometimes a broken chair or a cracked bottle followed, sometimes worse. But the sheriff had come to understand that authority was not just about drawing a weapon. It was about arriving with the confidence that no man in the room could mistake for weakness. He learned to walk in without needing to shout. He would nod once to the barkeep, who'd subtly indicate which knot of men to watch. With a calm voice and firm gaze, he would diffuse what he could. He rarely raised his voice. On some nights, just the thud of his boots on the wooden floor was enough to settle the dust. He knew every name, every family, every story behind the scuffed boots and crooked noses. That knowledge more than his pistol kept him alive. But the job was never just about stopping fists. There were the lies, too. Jealous husbands with wild imaginations. Shopkeepers blaming thefts on the same drifter week after week. A widow once accused a neighbor of poisoning her well, when all she would really needed was someone to grieve with. In a place like Dry Creek, justice meant listening more than judging. He kept a small notebook in his coat and jotted down what he heard. Not just crimes patterns, tensions, warnings. Some townsfolk expected iron justice. Others wanted mercy. But the sheriff had come to realize that both extremes were dangerous. He remembered how, after the arrest of Pete Rollins, some wanted a hanging on rumor alone. But Rollins, bruised and barely breathing when they hauled him in from the next county, had begged for water before words. The sheriff gave him both, then waited 3 days until Rollins spoke clearly enough to deny it all. Since then, rumors tangled like barbed wire. Some whispered that Rollins got what he deserved before he even stood trial. Others claimed the real killer of Samuel Johnson had skipped town the same night. But the sheriff did not deal in whispers. He dealt in truth, and when truth was slow in coming, in patience. He worked from dawn till past sundown. Land disputes between ranchers and newcomers. Livestock straying over invisible lines. Children caught stealing apples out of boredom, not hunger. Every day new knots to untangle. But through it all he tried to avoid the unnecessary use of force. That was not from weakness, it was out of belief. He would seen too many men treat violence as a shortcut to control, only to find themselves ruled by it in the end. Still, the town watched. They measured his decisions like they did the rainfall, and though no one said it out loud, everyone wondered how long before he would be tested for real. The answer came quietly one night in early spring. The sheriff was called to the outskirts, where 2 ranch hands were at each other's throats over a stolen saddle. By the time he arrived, blood had been drawn. One had a cracked cheekbone. The other had a knife, trembling in his grip. The sheriff stood between them, his voice calm but steel underneath. "This ends now," he said, and somehow they listened. He took them both in not as enemies, but as men too proud to step back. After patching their wounds, he sat with them outside the jailhouse until the first light broke over the hills. They did not speak much. Didn't have to. The sheriff simply offered tobacco, silence, and the dignity of not being treated like animals. That morning, neither man pressed charges. Word spread, as it always did. Not that the sheriff broke up another fight. No. What the town remembered was how he handled it. Without a bullet fired. Without humiliation. Without revenge. And so Dry Creek settled, if only for a little while. The dust still blew hard off the canyon. The cattle still mooed at dawn. The lone lantern still served too much whiskey on Fridays. But under it all, the town had begun to understand something rare. Their sheriff did not just keep the peace, he carried it, like a heavy coat, through every room he entered. In a town where memory was long and grudges longer, that kind of strength meant something. And though no one said it directly, more than one father, watching from a porch, hoped his son might grow up with that same quiet kind of fire. The town was changing faster than anyone had expected. More folks arriving each week. Farmers, shopkeepers, drifters looking to settle Trouble Creek no longer felt like the sleepy outpost it once was. And as the town grew, so did the demands on the sheriff's time. What had started as a one-man mission to keep the peace had turned into an impossible balancing act. The sheriff had been reluctant at first. He would never been the kind to ask for help. But after weeks of spreading himself too thin riding from one dispute to another, handling court records, checking the jail cells, responding to the mayor's endless requests, something had to give. The final straw came on a rainy morning when a prisoner managed to slip a loose, nailed from his cot, and nearly pried the door open before breakfast. It was not a grand escape, but it was a warning. The sheriff could no longer do it all alone. The mayor, a sharp-tongued man with ambitions far beyond the county, had been watching the situation closely. He saw in the sheriff both a political ally and a potential liability. He was fond of making appearances at the jailhouse to observe operations, which usually meant pointing out flaws and reminding the sheriff of budget constraints. But even he had to admit that order came at a cost. "You want a deputy," the mayor said one morning, sipping coffee that was too bitter to hide the sneer in his voice. "Then you would better find someone who won't embarrass this town. Someone clean. Someone local." The sheriff did not argue. He just nodded, tipped his hat, and stepped out into the street, already knowing who he would ask. That evening, under the soft glow of oil lamps, he sat across from Thomas Burke, a young man who'd served as a Union scout during the war and had since worked as a carpenter in the southern part of town. Thomas was sharp, reliable, and most of all, he listened. In a place where tempers flared quicker than prairie fire, that alone set him apart. "You sure?" Thomas asked, fingers tapping the side of his glass. The sheriff nodded. "I need someone who won't go looking for a fight but won't run from one either." With that, the badge was passed. Quietly, without ceremony. From the start, Thomas proved to be what the sheriff needed, a steady hand, someone to share the night patrols, to sit watch while the sheriff rode out to resolve disputes or file reports. Together, they fixed the rusted hinges on the cell doors and rewrote the duty logs that had been neglected for months. They took turns inspecting the cells, checking for weaknesses in the old brick and iron, and keeping the place cleaner than it had ever been. The jailhouse, once a symbol of disorder, began to command respect again. Patrols became more methodical. One would walk the eastern roads near the mill and the schoolhouse, while the other checked in with taverns and livery stables. On Sundays, they would alternate watch duties to let the other have time at home or with neighbors. Even the townsfolk noticed the change, less shouting in the streets, fewer fists flying after dark. It was not perfect, but it was progress. Still, being a deputy did not make Thomas immune to the politics of town life. Some resented his promotion, calling it favoritism. Others questioned his loyalty, whispering about his northern roots. But he never wavered. If he heard them, he did not let on. He just did the job, same as the sheriff had taught him: fair, firm, and quiet. As the weeks passed, the sheriff found himself able to breathe a little easier. Not that the job became simple, far from it. There were still fires to put out, tempers to cool, and injustices to sort through. But having Thomas meant he was not staring into every storm alone. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of fire and rust, the sheriff stood on the wooden steps of the jailhouse, watching the town settle into its nighttime rhythm. The saloon lights flickered to life, horses shuffled in their stalls, and shopkeepers pulled in their signs. Thomas approached from the west road, his boots leaving damp prints on the dusty path. "Nothing out of the ordinary," Thomas said, adjusting his belt, "though Mrs. Langford says her neighbor's chickens keep wandering onto her land again." The sheriff chuckled, the sound dry but genuine. Some things never change. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the street lamps flicker. "You ever think about how this place used to be?" Thomas asked. "Back when you first pinned on that star?" The sheriff nodded. "Too often. And if we are lucky, we will live long enough to be reminded of how different it will look again." He did not say it, but they both understood. Peace was not something you earned once. It was something you had to fight for, every day. And sometimes, the fight was not with guns or fists. It was in showing up, holding the line, and keeping hope alive in the smallest acts of order. By the time the frost had settled on the rooftops of Dry Creek and the autumn winds whispered through the cracked windows of the sheriff's modest home, the long days and longer nights had begun to wear on Sheriff Holden. The badge he wore so proudly in his early days had not lost its shine, but its weight felt heavier with every passing week. His back ached from the saddle. His boots were always dusty, and his heart bore the invisible bruises of choices made in silence. He had managed barroom brawls, defused tensions that could have erupted into bloodshed, and tried to walk the narrow line between justice and mercy, all while navigating the tangled web of frontier politics and the raw, fraying nerves of a town still defining its law. But what burdened him most was not just the criminals or the cowboys testing his authority. It was what he brought home each night, or rather, what he did not. Margaret, his wife of 12 years, had once told him she admired his conviction. She would stood beside him when he ran for office, held his hand the day he swore his oath, and kissed his forehead that first night he went out in the rain to break up a knife fight. But admiration had long since evolved into quiet endurance. She never complained. She folded his shirts and set out his breakfast each morning. She lit the oil lamp at dusk and waited up until she heard his boots on the porch, even if her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. What had once been laughter-filled dinners and long walks through town had become hushed meals and fleeting glances. The children noticed, too. Their son Daniel, only 8, had stopped asking if Papa would be home in time to read to him. Their daughter Rose had learned to braid her own hair, no longer waking Margaret early to help. Holden knew it. He saw the changes. He just did not know how to fix them. One night, after returning from a long ride to the southern farms where cattle theft had stirred trouble, he stood outside the door for nearly 10 minutes. The moon cast pale light over the quiet porch as he rested his hand on the doorknob, rehearsing a smile he hoped would feel real. When he stepped in, Margaret was sewing by the fireplace. She did not look up. "Came back late again," she said, her voice low but not unkind. There was trouble near Miller's Creek. A few of the steers were missing again. "You always have a reason, Holden." He did not reply. He pulled off his hat and hung it on the peg, dusted off his coat, and sat down across from her. The fire crackled between them, but there was a chill in the room no flame could warm. She did not cry. Margaret was not the crying kind. But there was a tiredness in her eyes he could not ignore, the kind that comes from worry stretched too thin over too many nights. "I miss you," she finally whispered. It was not an accusation, just a truth. Holden looked at the embers, red and flickering. He thought of the men he would arrested, the young ranch hand who'd been beaten before he could question him properly, the endless paperwork on the mayor's desk, and the echo of gunfire he could not forget from that cabin out by the ridge where Samuel Johnson had been found. He thought of the whispers in the saloons, the sideways looks from old-timers who questioned every decision he made, and now here was the cost of it all, sitting in front of him, unraveling thread by thread. "I never wanted to bring the job home," he said. "You did not have to," Margaret replied softly. "It followed you anyway." They sat in silence for a long while, the firelight dancing over the wood-paneled walls. Outside, an owl hooted from the cottonwood tree, and the wind tugged at the shutters. Eventually, Holden stood and walked behind her chair. He rested his hands on her shoulders, gently. She reached up and held one. For a moment, the world seemed still. But in Dry Creek, the world never stayed still for long. The next morning, a telegram arrived, another dispute out near the old silver mine, another long ride into unsettled territory. Margaret did not say anything as he saddled up, but her eyes held a plea he could not answer. As he rode away, Holden felt the ache not in his bones, but in his heart. He loved his town. He loved his duty. But he also loved his family. And for the first time since pinning on that badge, he was not sure he could serve all three without losing one. Each spring and autumn, just as the wind carried the scent of dust and blooming mesquite across the plains, the rhythm of the town shifted. With the thundering of hooves came the cowboys' young men, browned by the sun, worn by the trail, pockets flush from months on the open range. Their arrival was not quiet. Dust clouds rolled in ahead of them like a warning. Behind them, longhorns bellowed and stamped at the pens just outside town, while inside, every saloon door swung on overworked hinges, and every whiskey barrel groaned under sudden demand. To most locals, the cattle drive season was a necessary disruption. Merchants welcomed the business, boarding houses filled quickly, and poker tables saw stacks of silver dollars change hands. But to the sheriff, it was the season of sleepless nights. He had been in the job long enough to read the signs when tempers ran hot and spirits flowed freely. Chaos always came knocking. It began subtly. A couple of ranch hands arguing over a game of 5-card stud at the Broken Spur. Raised voices, slammed fists. He was called to cool them down, no arrests. Just a firm word and a steady hand. But as the days passed, and the cowboys settled into town like dust in every crevice, the stakes rose. By the end of the week, it was more than shouting matches. The sheriff stepped out of his office one evening to find a crowd forming outside the Golden Lantern. 2 men were squared off, pistols still holstered but hands twitching. He knew that kind of silence, taut and waiting to snap. He did not reach for his gun. He did not need to. Instead, he stepped between them, heavy boots crunching gravel, and looked each man dead in the eye. He reminded them not of the law, but of the grave, and how quickly boys ended up in it when pride got louder than sense. It was not courage that made them back down. It was the weight in his voice, the kind that only came from a man who had seen what a bullet did to bone. Still, not every encounter ended in words. One night, a brawl broke out in the rear of the Silver Buckle. Chairs shattered. A bottle flew, catching a drummer from Missouri across the brow. The sheriff and his newly hired deputy, Tom Lantry, had to drag 3 men to the jail, their shouts echoing off the cell walls like caged thunder. The sheriff did not raise his hand unless he had to, but that night he had to. Margaret, his wife, watched the procession from the window. She never said much about these nights. Just folded his spare shirt, warmed his supper on the stove, and prayed quietly long after he would fallen asleep on the porch. She knew what the job cost, and she knew cattle drives made the price higher. The sheriff understood that these cowboys were not villains. Most were just tired men chasing freedom or trying to forget something, perhaps a lost family, perhaps a war. But when whiskey turned pain into fire, even the gentlest soul could throw a punch or draw a weapon faster than their shadow. And amid the chaos, there was still the rest of his job. Tax collections had to be filed, property disputes settled. The jail needed repairs, the back cell door stuck again, and the town's council wanted new ordinances on livestock penned within city limits. The mayor, never one to see mud on his own boots, voiced his concerns from the comfort of the saloon's private parlor, demanding that the sheriff show more control, as if order could be snapped into existence like kindling. But the sheriff was not a magician, he was a man. And that week, being that man meant breaking up 2 more brawls, standing between a rancher and a card cheat, and diffusing a volatile standoff when 2 strangers, both drunk and both certain they would have been insulted, met outside the bathhouse at dusk. Through it all, he relied on Lantry more and more. The young deputy learned fast how to read trouble in a man's gait, how to speak in a tone that could cool boiling blood. But there were moments when Lantry's hand hovered too long near his revolver, or when he flinched at a door creaking open too quickly. The sheriff took note, knowing the boy still had shadows to outgrow. Then came the Sunday shootout. It started over a woman, or more precisely, a misunderstanding about a woman. One cowboy accused another of stepping too close to a dance hall girl he would been calling his. It spiraled from slurs to shoves to drawn steel. The sheriff heard the first shot from across the street. He ran toward the echo, boots thudding against the dirt, his coat flapping like a second heartbeat. The street had emptied into doorways by the time he arrived. One man lay on the ground, groaning. The other was still holding his gun, panting, eyes wild. The sheriff approached, calm and slow. No speeches this time. Just the cold command to drop the weapon. It clattered to the ground a second later. By the time the cattle moved on and the dust settled again, the town bore the signs of a week under siege-cracked windows, bruised faces and worn nerves. The sheriff sat on the steps of his office as the sun dipped low behind the church spire, the horizon painted in blood-orange hues. He knew this peace was borrowed time. Another drive would come, another week of reckoning. But for now he closed his eyes, exhaled the tension, and let the silence wash over him like a prayer he never had time to say out loud. As the sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting long golden rays across the parched earth of the frontier town, the sheriff stood on the edge of his porch, arms crossed over his chest, watching the world quiet itself. It had been years since he first pinned the badge to his vest, years that had stripped away illusions, tempered his ideals, and reshaped the very way he saw justice. In that time he had faced more than his fair share of violence, betrayal, and grief. Yet somehow through it all he had not become a bitter man, he had become a grounded one. The town around him had changed. Where once it had been a scattering of shacks and dust, it now held schools, families, businesses, with sturdy brick walls, and the kind of quiet that did not come naturally to frontier land. That quiet had been hard-earned, bought with long nights patrolling empty streets, long talks with angry men, and decisions made in the lonely gray space between right and wrong. But even in the midst of this fragile peace, the sheriff knew the land had not forgotten its wilder past. Every cattle drive brought its wave of heat and chaos. Every land dispute had the potential to ignite long-held grudges. Every barroom brawl could, in an instant, turn deadly. He still carried the weight of every arrest, every shooting. Every time he would have to look a family in the eye and explain why justice came too late. And yet, he kept showing up. Margaret had stayed by his side through it all, never loud about her fears, never asking him to quit, even when she watched him ride off into danger. Their home had seen sleepless nights, anxious prayers, and quiet tears, but also laughter, the smell of warm bread, and the soft footsteps of their daughter learning to walk. For all the sheriff had done for the town, he knew the most important work he ever did happened within those 4 walls, teaching his daughter that strength and kindness were not opposites, and showing Margaret, in small daily ways, that he never took her patience for granted. He thought back to Samuel Johnson's murder, to the day Pete Rollins was dragged in, bloodied and silent, to the time the mayor threatened to fire him if he did not control the saloon riots. He remembered breaking up bar fights without ever needing to draw his weapon, navigating old feuds with nothing more than a quiet voice and steady eyes. And he remembered hiring a young deputy, a nervous boy from Missouri, who had grown into a capable man under his wing. That deputy now took over most of the patrols, allowing the sheriff a few more nights at home. He also remembered the failures. The boy who got caught in a crossfire, the drifter who slipped through town and left 2 bodies behind, the former rancher who burned down his own barn in a drunken rage. Each case chipped away at something inside him. But each case also reinforced why he wore the badge, not to punish, not to dominate, but to protect, to guide, to make sure that in a world often governed by chaos, someone stood as a reminder that justice did not have to be cruel. In recent months, he had begun writing things down. Stories. Lessons. A sort of record for the next man who might wear the badge, or maybe just for his daughter to read one day. He did not romanticize it. This was not the stuff of dime novels. It was messy, it was thankless, but it mattered. Looking out across the street, he saw lights dim in the saloon, the laughter of cowhands tapering off as the night settled in. Somewhere, a harmonica played a soft, drifting tune. In that moment, with the town still breathing and the stars overhead blinking quietly to life, he felt a rare kind of peace, not the peace of victory, but of endurance, of having stood the test. He turned back into the house. Margaret was reading by the fire. Their daughter, now 6, was curled up with a worn cloth doll in her lap. He hung his hat, unfastened the badge from his chest, and stepped quietly into the warmth of home. Justice, he had come to realize, was not always about bold action or public praise. Sometimes it was just about staying, trying, showing up even when it was hard. And for all the darkness he had witnessed, the story of his life, like the town itself, was ultimately one of survival, growth, and meaning. Thank you for listening to this story of grit, family, and the quiet heroism that built the backbone of small towns across the American frontier. If you found this story compelling, please consider giving it a like, subscribing for more narratives like this, and sharing it with someone who loves powerful, grounded storytelling. Until next time, sleep well, stay safe, and good night.